Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graven. Our guest today is Dr. Jessica Kriegel. She's Chief Strategy Officer of Workforce and Labor at Culture Partners, and she's also an internationally recognized speaker. Known for her transformative culture equation, and I think we'll get to talk about that today, Jessica has been featured on CNBC, MSNBC, CNN, and more. At Culture Partners, she leads pioneering research and strategy with Stanford University, working to reshape the DNA of Fortune 10 and Fortune 500 companies for their long-term success. So Jessica holds a doctorate in human resources development and educational leadership from Drexel University. She's the author of the book Unfairly Labeled, a book that challenges generational stereotypes in the workplace. And she also hosts the podcast Culture Leaders, where she dives in with her guests into the essence of true transformation. So Jessica, thank you for being here on the podcast. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Well, we're turning the tables here. I had the opportunity to talk with you on your show, and I'm happy we can continue the conversation here. So before we kind of go through, other things related to culture and your work passions, would love to hear your story. What's your favorite mistake?
Well, my favorite mistake that's work related was when I was at Oracle. I had been there for many, many years. In all, I was at Oracle for 9 or 10 years. And somewhere in the middle there, maybe closer towards the end, I had a client. So my clients at the time were Oracle executives. I was in the HR department doing organizational development. So I was kind of coaching and consulting as they had needs to transform their workforce to work towards different initiatives. I would go in and help them with that. And one of the executives that I supported was the newly hired head of cloud. Mm-hmm. And his name was Sean Price. He was this hotshot executive that had been at the top of his game and many of our competitors. And he had this work hard, play hard type of lifestyle where he would go into an organization, help it transform, and then he would quit, and then he would take 2 years off and go sailboating around the world or something insane. So he got hired at Oracle, and I got assigned to work with him. And he understood the power of culture in transformation, especially broad scale transformation like that one, moving from on-prem to cloud at Oracle. And he was leading that effort. So he called me on the first week that he was there, which was rare in that role at that time, to get FaceTime with the executive you were working with in week one.
Yeah.
And he asked me to come to the headquarters and work with him. We were in a conference room for 3 days, figuring out what culturally needs to change in order to drive this transformation effort. We got along great, and we had this incredible productive session. And by the end of those 3 days, which was still his first week of being there, he asked me to come on and be his head of strategy, be the head of strategy for the head of cloud at Oracle. Yeah. I was one person away from the CEO. And at the time, I was this individual contributor working in HR that was like doing interesting work, but it was not a promotion. It was like 7 promotions. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I was just, hell yes, was my response. Absolutely. I will be there. Not a problem. And I was so excited. And he made the paperwork fly through. I got a huge raise. And it was great. And for the first week or two, I was like, man, I am struggling, but this is great. And then on the 3rd week, I was like, I'm dying. And then on the 4th week, I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I mean, the pace of work, the demands of the work, the expectations. I mean, I remember one time he called me at 3:00 in the morning. And he said, can you convert this PowerPoint to a PDF at 3:00 in the morning? And I was like,
could you Google that?
Are you serious, dude? Like, it's 3:00 in the morning. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm in Australia. I later found out from someone on our team that right before he called me that moment, he said, I'll just call Jessica and she'll do it for us. And the person he was with said, oh, it's 3:00 in the morning where she is. And he said, I don't care. And he called me to ask me that. So within a month and a half, I called my old boss in the HR department and I said, I'm going to leave Oracle because there is no way I can sustain this. It's not worth the money. It's not worth the influence or the job title. I need to go back to where I was, or I'm just going to leave. Have you filled my position? And she
Yeah.
welcomed me back with open arms, and I got to stay at Oracle and go back to the old job. So why was that my favorite mistake? I mean, you could see it as a pretty typical story about, I chose money and title over work-life balance. And, that's true. The other thing was the work I did with him in that 1 month and a half was the most transformative learning experience I had.
Mm.
It was actually the basis of the culture equation, which
Mm.
is what I sold to culture partners years later.
Yeah.
I learned more in that month and a half than I did in the 5 years previous. And so there was also this realization that if you want to do monumental great things that change the world, sometimes you've got to kick your own ass, sometimes you've got to put in the work beyond what you're able to do. And sometimes the burnout can lead to wonderful things too. So that was my favorite mistake, was taking that job, burning myself out, leaving that job, taking what I learned at that job, turning it into a career and selling it to culture partners years later.
Well, I'm glad it led to something positive and a lot of positives. 6 weeks is a pretty accelerated burnout cycle, wouldn't you say? Or
Yeah, it was. I can't tell you. It was, not only, there was also this expectation to go into the headquarters. I lived in Sacramento and it was Redwood Shores. So I was driving hours and hours for no reason. And then I would show up and there would be no reason to be there. It was completely illogical. And here's the follow-up story to that. He died just a few years later. Theoretically, he was a very healthy person, but I think that the pace at which he was running himself and the stress from the demands and the expectations were so high that, I believe that the disease that he got was a result of this high intensity stress environment, pushing himself so hard. So, yeah, it was beyond. I work with a lot of executives who think that they're super busy, and I see what they're doing. And I think, not as busy as I was for those 6 weeks. It was burning the midnight oil every night,
Yeah.
It's like investment banker Wall Street Journal levels of, 90 hours a week or whatever it was.
Yeah. Yeah. There's busy, and then there's stressful, there's demanding, and then there's disrespectful. Like, I'm just curious, like, was that 3 a.m. call, was that kind of a sign of some sort of, pattern of broader disrespect, or was that just a matter of working hard and him thinking time pressure was the most important thing?
I think that he put a lot of pressure on himself.
Yeah.
And I think that at the highest levels of the biggest companies in the world, the expectations are severe. There's excellence, and then there's the door. Those are the two options. And so he came in and he had to prove himself, and he probably felt pressure from outsiders and from himself. And he was very willing to push that pressure onto the people on his team. And there were a lot of people who thrived in that environment. And there were a lot of people who left in that environment.
Yeah. Do you see a difference, in the work that you're doing now? Is that even more true at the Fortune 10, Fortune 50 level? Is it, once you get to a certain size company, Fortune 500, all inclusive? Is that, are those demands similar, or is there variation in culture and expectations across those companies?
It's so uniquely particular to the leader and their value system. I have seen that kind of pressure at small mom and pop shops, and I've seen very little pressure at the Fortune 10, actually, because people value family or work-life balance, or they see perspective, or they don't want to be run by fear, or whatever it is. So and within one company, it's not all the same story either, right? It's who do you report into and how much leeway will they give you ultimately? And there's a spectrum.
Yeah. And, you're around Silicon Valley. Are you also working with startups where what's this kind of recent phrase? It's almost a meme of founder mode. Have you heard the discussion about this?
Yes, absolutely. And I've worked for a founder. So after I left Oracle, I went and became the chief people and culture officer at a small tech SaaS firm. We were, 50 employees in the US and another 150 in India. And it was a totally different vibe. We didn't have the kind of burnout culture. What we had was a founder who wanted to be in control of the most minute decisions and therefore
Mhm.
was in everything and completely disempowering all of his employees at every level to make any kind of decisions, and all
Yeah.
sorts of strange things happening with unethical decisions being made with the company money, and hiring people that were family members that were unqualified for the work. And I mean, there was just
Yeah.
so much chaos, and it
Mhm.
was just amateur hour, that creates a different kind of burnout, because you're
Yeah.
having to deal with this philosophical and value-based burnout, not just how hard are you working the midnight oil.
Yeah. And I mean, it maybe also gets you thinking, boy, this doesn't seem like a successful culture. Why am I
Yeah.
going to keep pouring myself into this?
Yeah. So, I mean, what is culture, right? Let's start there. The culture is how people think and act to get results.
Mhm.
And so at Oracle, for example, in that place at that time, the way people were thinking and acting to get results is work as hard as you can and don't stop working and push,
Mhm.
push, push. At the smaller tech firm, it was get away with it however you can.
Mm.
Just make it work, get
Right.
it done, right? And if you have to lie a little bit, lie a little bit. If you have to promise something that isn't really built yet, then promise something that isn't really built yet. Those are different ways of thinking and acting. Neither of them really worked for me, obviously. But there were other places at Oracle that were so nurturing and so wonderful, and the way that people thought and acted to get results was innovative and boundary pushing and learning focused and work-life balanced, so you just got to find the place that
Mhm.
works for you.
Yeah. Well, so I was going to ask you for your definition of culture, because that's a word that gets thrown around, and people may have different definitions or mental models in their mind about what that means. So maybe the follow up question then is about the culture equation,
Yes.
and that as a way to think through culture.
Yeah, so that was what I invented with Sean in those 6 weeks, and we needed a way to transform the way that people were thinking and acting at work, because Oracle was an on-prem company. That's what all their 95% of their revenue came from on-premise products, and we needed to move it to be a cloud company.
Mhm.
And that doesn't just require product development. That requires an entirely different way of speaking with customers, different customers that we're speaking to. It requires a different business model within the organization. It requires the education of, like, what is the cloud, right? This was many, many years ago when this was cutting edge stuff at the
Mhm.
time. And so we had to understand, how can we get people to not only embrace this new thing, but also not be afraid of it? Because think of the equivalent would be AI today. A
Yeah.
lot of people are resistant to adopting AI because it feels like it's going to replace their jobs. And they're not wrong,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
It is going to replace their jobs. So how can you as a business leader get people to embrace something that is not in their best interest? It's a very strange game, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the way that we did it at Oracle was we educated people that there's two paths here. You can either get on board and your job will get lost, but you could get another job doing this something else, but you've got
Right.
to learn how to do that new thing. Or you can resist it and eventually you'll get pushed out anyway, right?
Right.
So the culture equation is about putting all of that together. And very simply, what it is it's your purpose plus your strategy powered by culture to get results. And
Mhm.
so the purpose is your why, the strategy is your how, and the culture is the way. And
Yeah.
what Sean understood in this transformation to cloud was, you can't just have the strategy, which is
Mhm.
what most leaders do, right? They focus on strategy. Oh, we're going to invest in AI. There's your strategy. It's done. It's not
Right.
hard to change strategy. All you got to do is get a couple of executives in the room that have decision-making power, and you look at some new decision or idea, and they say, let's do that. You put it on a slide, and boom, your strategy is different, right?
Yeah.
Now, how do you get people within the organization, especially at a large organization, to operationalize that strategy through the way that they think and act? That's the culture piece, is how do you
Right.
get to the hearts and minds? And that's what we were figuring out, was the ultimately the beliefs that people have about the nature of the work that you're trying to get them to do, about the strategy, about you as a leader, about each other, about the company, about the customer, about their own purpose, those beliefs will drive their action.
Mhm.
And that is what's going to get you the result. You as a leader have to go deeper than just focusing on telling them what to do. You got to get them to believe that we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately the amplifying power of culture in driving business results. It's getting people to have the right mindset, to have the right beliefs so that you can really drive action.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I want to come back and talk more about your TED Talk. But the things you're talking about there about culture are so much more meaningful than, let's say, perks, ping pong tables, free food, some of the kind of superficial things that people often, I think, describe culture as being, when it's really more to this core of what, why, and how. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there's different evolutions of understanding. So the mass public probably still thinks of culture as ping pong tables and
Yeah.
are you forced in the office or not? And, pizza parties, right?
Yeah. We're having fun.
For CHROs and CEOs and COOs who are leading the organization, I think they figured out that that wasn't culture maybe 5-10 years ago, right? And 5-10
Mhm.
years ago, they started thinking culture was like DEI and
Mhm.
ESG and all of that bring your authentic self to work stuff. That's also not culture, right? And now I think we're finally turning the corner on executives and CEOs understanding that that's not culture either. Culture is ultimately, it's like how people think and act at work. There is nothing more powerful that for a CEO to drive results than how people think and act at work.
Mhm.
And so they're starting to figure that out now. And part of that is I see it as my mission, and at Culture Partners, it's our mission to evangelize for the power of culture and driving results, because there's a win-win where
Right.
businesses can succeed and people are happy and they're in a culture that works for them.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on the way people think and act about mistakes as a leader? When an employee makes a mistake, what do you see happening, or what do you try to coach people through related to that?
Well, you probably know way more than I do, and all of your guests have probably shared that it is hard to admit mistakes,
Mhm.
especially in a leadership position, because we've been elevated to be an authority,
Yeah.
right? That's leadership is you are now higher than everyone else. You get paid more, you got a title that looks fancier, and you are above them literally in the organizational chart. And so therefore, you got to make sure that everyone trusts that you know what you're doing and that you make sound decisions. And this is part of why we see this data-driven insight obsession right now. Not because leaders want to make sure they make the right decision. It's because leaders want to make sure they have data to justify the decisions that they've made, so that if the decision was wrong, they can say, well, the data said, right? It's the total cover
Right.
your tail situation.
Right.
And yet, when we read the leadership books about the greatest leaders in the world, they are the humble
Hmm.
servant leaders who spoke to the frontline workers, were in the factory floor doing the work side by side on
Yeah.
weekends, who were asking questions, who were listening. You watch Undercover Boss, and it speaks to the American public so much because that's what they're looking for in leadership. And
Hmm.
yet, there is this massive disconnect between what you actually see in leadership, especially the leaders that get the headlines, like Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and these people who are well known for the opposite of humble leadership,
Right.
right?
Right.
Arrogant leadership is what they are
Right.
known for and revered for. And it just blows my mind. And so, why is that, and what's the answer? I think that the answer why that is because this it's a great idea to be a servant leader and to be humble, and people do feel compelled to follow those kinds of leaders, but the system of corporate America does not actually incentivize humility, right? It incentivizes you justifying your place. It incentivizes getting results at all costs,
Hmm.
and it incentivizes short-term results over long-term thinking.
Sure.
And so we have to work against the systemic structures in place that are
Mm.
trying to squeeze us into being bad leaders.
Mm.
And some of
Yeah.
us do, and then we crack the code, and some of us don't, and we crack the
Yeah.
code. And that's the game of leadership. It's figuring out how to be the thing that technically the system doesn't want you to be, but the people do.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, there thankfully are some rare exceptions. People can be, I guess, countercultural, maybe is an applicable word. I think of, there's a SaaS tech company have been involved with called Kinexus, where the co-founders have been very intentional about creating culture, and they're not those type of, arrogant leaders that you described. They don't inject themselves into every single decision. I think they're cultivating, kind of a very healthy culture, and at the Fortune 100 scale, or they're probably higher up in that list, Toyota, I think is a rare company that emphasizes things like leading with humility, long-term decision making. That's probably even more rare than the humility piece. So there are some companies that I think are successful because they have a culture that flies in the face of what might be out there on TV shows or being taught in business programs.
Yeah. And then some go too far in that direction. That's the other mistake that can be made. You look at REI right now, they've been getting really bad results for 2 years, I think it is.
Yeah.
And they are known as the company that invests in their people, and the co-op model and the perks and the we're not open on Black Friday and all of these things that are countercultural, right? Which are all about the employees, and it's not working for them. And I think they've become a little bit so entrenched in we are this culture, and they've made their equivalent of the pizza party is being closed on Black Friday, right? Yeah. They're committed to this idea because that's the vibe of who they want to be perceived as. But like, maybe you should open on Black Friday. Maybe there's another way of being. And so sometimes our culture can be so strong that it also works against us. So we have to think of it not as the persona that we want to be, but rather how we want people to think and act in order to get results.
Yeah. And that how to get results piece is so critical. We don't want to have a great culture, happy culture. I mean, I think, I learned over time, I think the difference in language between employee satisfaction and employee engagement. Like employee satisfaction as just the end all be all could lead to business failure, where I think, employee engagement goes hand in hand with customer focus. And, thinking of REI, and I've only been in an REI store a couple times, so I'm not that outdoorsy, but big brand, famous brand, of course. But if customers want to shop on Black Friday, again, I don't, but a lot of people do, how much are they hurting themselves? Yeah, that time will tell, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I just wrote an ebook about that, where I think, employee satisfaction is what we were measuring before the 1990s, right? That was kind of, are you happy here? And that was a good enough measurement. And then a bunch of management consultants got together and said, what's better than satisfaction is engagement, because it's also, engagement is defined as to what extent you are focused and paying attention to the task at hand, right?
Yeah.
And engagement is better than satisfaction to CEOs because it's tied to productivity. Right. To what extent are you focused on and paying attention to the task at hand? But I think we've overdone it, especially after COVID, where engagement has become a productivity obsession. And that's what's leading to a lot of burnout. You saw some of the peak levels of, some of the peak levels of burnout post-COVID, because people were working from home from the morning until the end of the day. So in this ebook, I suggest kind of a new path forward, which is employee fulfillment. And employee fulfillment is all about, do you feel like you can fulfill your own purpose by helping us with our organizational purpose? You're fulfilling meaning. You're fulfilling the goals. Your fulfillment is much more important than just your engagement, your focus on the task at hand, or even your satisfaction, which is really about feelings, and feelings aren't facts, and feelings are fleeting, right? So I think you're going to see an evolution in the way people measure whatever that employee number is, which again, we got to be data driven, right? Maybe I think we're going to start to see a move towards employee fulfillment and away from engagement as we move into the next decade.
I love that's a great word. That's a more meaningful word. I mean, I think, how do we find a word and an approach that's win-win?
Yeah,
not just
exactly.
satisfaction. I mean, like I've been, we could be sitting around eating ice cream and talking about movies all day at work and be really satisfied and then go out of business. Or
Right.
then engagement, if that's just all for the company benefit. I mean, I think of
Yep.
the movie Office Space and the big, huge banner. Is this good for the company? That funny scene, a really exaggerated but not too much mindset versus, something where, I think sometimes people in healthcare have a good idea about, I hear it more expressed in healthcare, but I think it applies in other businesses. Take care of the staff so they can take care of the patients. I
Yeah.
think in a very mutually beneficial, non-paternalistic or maternalistic kind of way when we say take care of, but, support the employees, engage them so that they can do the things they want and need to do.
Yeah. You see that in tech a lot too. EX for CX,
Mm,
your employees will not take care of your customers unless
there
they're
we
taken
go.
care of.
And the shorthand EX, employee experience,
Yes.
and CX, customer experience. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Goes hand in hand. So I wanted to ask a little bit about your TED Talk. First off on the title, how to help people give a shit. Was it hard to get that title through, or they're like, "Hey, it's your talk, your title"?
No, it was not hard at all. I think that's why I got through.
Okay, well, good. Yeah.
Uh,
So so maybe first off in the problem statement, like, what are the symptoms of quote unquote people not giving a shit?
well, I think it was the thing that I was hearing the most from executives that we were working with, is that people just don't wanna work anymore. Remember that got really popular for a while. Millennials don't wanna work, Gen Zers just don't wanna work. They just don't care about the goals of the organization. I can't get them motivated. No one's
Mhm.
taking accountability. I mean, it was the number one thing we were hearing so consistently for so long that I started to dig into it. And what I found was, I'm making this up right now, the apathy paradox. And
Mhm.
it was essentially the paradox of what seemed to be apathy. According to the executives, the employees were apathetic, right? They just don't give a shit. And then we would work with the employees and we were doing interviews. We were walking on the factory floors. We were working with them in workshops and doing breakout sessions where we were getting feedback from them. And as it turned out, there was a distinct lack of apathy from those
Yeah.
people. They weren't checked out. They were so frustrated, they were so overwhelmed.
Mhm.
They were
Mhm.
so fearful for their future, for job security, for the economy, for the pandemic, for global Armageddon in whatever form and fashion it takes this year. Now we got to warn Ukraine. Now we got a nuclear, now the election. Everyone has got something to fear right now.
Yeah.
And so they were being so overwhelmed emotionally that what do people do from a psychological standpoint when they're feeling so
Mhm.
overwhelmed is they dissociate, they shut down.
Right.
And so it's about caring so much that you check out.
Mhm.
And it looks like not caring. And so
Yeah.
actually what was happening was people were caring a lot. And there was so much care that it felt so overwhelming that they couldn't handle it anymore and they checked out. So
Mhm.
therefore, that's really what we found was the key to get people to give a shit, was to kind of unlock their ability to give a shit by not dissociating in order to therefore get back to work, right?
Yeah. 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 And there's a professor at University of Texas, Austin, who Ethan Burris, who's done a lot of great research on, why do people choose to not use their voice? And, he said, it comes down to two main things: fear or futility.
Mm,
And I think, and that to me, that was insightful. I've sadly worked in workplaces where fear was prevalent. It was being demonstrated that it was dangerous to speak up and challenge things. But I think that insight, what you were saying reminded me of that. Of where people may shut down because they've spoken up and nothing happens, so they stop speaking up. And I think executives then often misdiagnose that as they don't care. I'm like, no, it's been demonstrated that caring and speaking up didn't lead to anything, so why bother?
Yeah,
It's that.
absolutely. I've had that experience. I've had both the fear and the futility experience. I remember one time I was in an executive leadership meeting, and what we were talking about was something that was a fundamental difference in beliefs between me and my boss. And I had tried to talk to my boss about this 1,000 times before, and I could just tell I wasn't going to change his mind. And so there we were in the executive meeting, and he's presenting this thing that is I totally disagree with, and he's asking for feedback. And on any other day, I would have jumped in and said, well, let me talk about, but I had reached the point of futility. And I knew that if I
Mhm.
spoke up, it was just going to be a career limiting move. I was just going to be
Oh,
making a bad impression. And so I remember repeating in my head over and over again, just be quiet, just be quiet, just be quiet,
mm,
just be quiet, and
yeah,
I was
it's sad.
quiet.
Yeah.
And he was so pleased with himself. At the end of the meeting, he was like, well, great. I guess we're all on the same page. I was like, absolutely. And we walked out of the room, and I was
Yeah.
so glad I didn't speak up because I knew it
Mhm.
wouldn't have gone anywhere. It just would have given him a bad taste in my mouth. And he is, once again, talking about the systemic incentive to be quiet.
Mhm.
He's in charge of my salary. He's in charge of my job security. He's in
Yeah.
charge of my career development. He's in charge of my budget. He's in charge of my headcount. He's in charge of everything that I need in order to be effective, right? And to have what I need. So
Yeah.
it was futile.
And an executive, maybe again misdiagnosing the situation of we're all on the same page. That culture where people shut down, stifle themselves when they want to or need to speak up. I don't think anyone would say rationally that leads to innovation and
Right.
success, but
Yeah.
they somehow get in that trap anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's the very thing that doesn't lead to
Hmm.
innovation. Innovation requires risk. When one
Hmm.
firm that we were working with asked us to come in to help create a more innovative culture, and they ended up creating a failure CV
Hmm.
that everyone had to write up. And in order to be part of this innovation committee, you had to submit your failure CV, right? And everyone and the leaders would share their failures
Yeah.
first at
Right.
the
Good.
beginning of meetings to help. And then when a failure happened, it was celebrated on town halls and team calls and
Hmm.
in emails where they would say, look at this great mistake that she made. Thank you so much for putting yourself out there. And,
Hmm.
it took some time, but it was leader led. The leaders had to go first.
Right. 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 Maybe the final question for you, Jessica. You brought up some of these generational dynamics questions. So maybe this brings us to your book, Unfairly Labeled. So we need you to say things like, oh, millennials don't want to work anymore. Like when that phrase was really flying around, I saw there was some professor, I forget where, had gone back and found news articles going back to like the early 1800s of
Hmm.
different variations of the young people today don't have the
Yeah.
same work ethic.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I can go back even further. Socrates, 2,500 years ago, was quoted as saying, young people today value chatter in the place of hard work and luxury. I mean, the complaints have not changed in
right.
over 2,000 years, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just it's the nature of people, and something about getting old makes you bitter towards the young people. I actually experienced it. So funny. Like 5 years after I wrote my book, which the whole point of my book is to say generational stereotypes are all bullshit. Stop saying that.
Right.
Don't think about your workforce in terms of generation. It's going to take you
Mm.
down the wrong path, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And 5 years after I wrote that book and created an entire keynote career around
Hmm.
spouting off the lessons from my research and my, the power of not buying into this generational stereotypes, I found myself having thoughts about young people today. I was like, those Gen Zers are totally, and I'm like, wow, I can make this a career, and I still fall into that trap. So there is something biological about it, I think. So I have
Yeah.
empathy for the people who do it, but as a leader, you
Sure.
cannot buy into that.
Yeah. Well, so there's a bonus mistake that you've admitted.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank
Bonus.
you for doing that, Jessica. And then I think there's those complaints about generations, and then you hear things like, well, maybe it's a complaint, but I would view as a positive of, oh, Gen Z, they want to do work that has purpose. I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm
because
Gen
baby
X.
boomers don't care about purpose at
Yeah.
all, right?
Yeah.
I
I mean,
mean, just
I'm,
that language is exclusionary. Think about
yeah.
when you say someone is this way, then what you're saying is the
Mm,
others aren't. And
Right.
so, yeah, anyway, I
That's
cut
my
you
beef.
off, but it bothers me even when it's positive.
Yeah. I mean, I'm Gen X, and Gen X has the stereotype of being the slackers who don't care and all that. But
Cynical.
cynical, but maybe we quickly got cynical. No, I don't know. But I mean, I think all young people in a workplace, what the thing we're often describing about that this new generation might be just a description of young people, and then sadly workplace cultures kind of drum that out of people. They're kind
Yeah,
of taught like, oh,
what's happening with workplace culture is employee expectations are changing,
mhm,
right? And more due to technology and social media than due to generational dynamics. People are sharing information more and more. So your brand and your culture are now one and the same.
mm,
If your culture is crappy and people post about it online, your brand is going to be worse off for the
mhm,
matter, right? So we're sharing information in a multi-directional way. We're more transparent than ever, sadly, according to the executive. I mean, the
mhm.
executives wish there was less transparency, but we can
Yeah.
figure out each other's pay. We can see what reviews we're leaving on anonymous job sites like Glassdoor and
Mhm.
Blind, and people are posting on social media. They're literally quitting live on air with their
Yeah.
manager being streamcast to the entire world, and the manager
Yeah.
doesn't even know it. So those things are making leaders up their game.
Mhm.
Expectations are changing, and the young people are being blamed for it because of their generation, but this is silliness.
Or bullshit. I like that.
Or bullshit. Yes, thank you.
So, our guest today, Dr. Jessica Kriegel. I hope you'll check out. I'll put links in the show notes. The firm Culture Partners, her podcast Culture Leaders, her book Unfairly Labeled, and the TED Talk. I want to make sure I get this right. How to help people give a shit. If I'm going to curse, I want to be accurate. I don't mind. I don't mind the words. So thank you for bringing so much more than the word shit to the conversation, Jessica. I really appreciate your insights and your story and you being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.